Ethan Carter was a man who always dreamed big. From the moment he graduated college, he set his sights on climbing the corporate ladder. He wanted success, not just a little, but enough to make people notice. But ambition has a way of consuming everything around it, and for Ethan, that meant sacrificing the people closest to him. Claire had been his college sweetheart, the one person who believed in him when no one else did. She supported him through late nights spent studying and early mornings chasing internships. When they got married, Ethan promised her the world. But as time went on, his focus shifted. Work became his priority, and Claire often found herself alone, waiting for him to come home from yet another long day at the office. Their arguments started small, comments about missed dinners or forgotten anniversaries, but soon grew louder and more frequent. Claire tried to remind him of the life they once shared, but Ethan brushed her off. "We need stability," he'd say. "Once I'm successful, we'll have everything we've ever wanted." But Claire wasn't sure she could wait that long. The spark between them dimmed with each passing month, replaced by frustration and disappointment. One particularly tense evening, the argument reached its peak. Money, or rather, the lack of it, was the issue again. Claire had been working part-time while trying to keep their household running smoothly, but Ethan's salary barely covered the bills. His constant promises of better days ahead felt hollow to her now. As they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken resentment, Ethan snapped. "I can't do this anymore," he said abruptly, standing up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "This isn't the life I signed up for." Claire stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. "What are you saying?" He hesitated, guilt flickering across his face, but then he hardened himself. "I'm saying, maybe we're not good for each other anymore." That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He laid awake, replaying the fight in his mind, wondering if he was making the right choice. By morning, he had convinced himself that leaving was the only way forward. Quietly, he packed a suitcase, careful not to wake Claire. He scribbled a brief note, "I'm sorry," and left it on the counter before stepping out into the cold dawn. As he drove away, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and dread. On one hand, he believed he was freeing himself from a life that stifled his dreams. On the other, he couldn't shake the image of Claire sleeping peacefully, unaware that he was gone. He told himself she'd be better off without him, that she deserved someone who could give her the life she wanted. Deep down, though, he knew he was running away from problems he didn't know how to fix. For weeks after leaving, Ethan avoided thinking about Claire altogether. He threw himself into work, taking on extra projects and overtime shifts. The busier he stayed, the less room there was for regret. Friends asked about her occasionally, but Ethan brushed them off with vague answers. It didn't work out, he'd say with a shrug, as if their marriage had been nothing more than a failed experiment. But late at night, when the world was quiet and there was no one to distract him, Ethan would wonder what Claire was doing. Was she angry? Sad? Had she moved on already? These questions lingered in the back of his mind, unresolved, like a puzzle missing its final piece. Little did he know, the choices he made that fateful morning would ripple through the years, shaping not just his future, but also hers, and setting the stage for a twist neither of them could have anticipated. Life moved quickly for Ethan after he walked out on Claire. At first, the freedom felt exhilarating. No more arguments about money, no more guilt over missed dinners or forgotten promises. He could focus entirely on his career without distractions. And focus he did. Within months, Ethan earned a promotion that came with a hefty raise and a corner office. His colleagues admired his dedication, and his boss praised him as a rising star in the company. On paper, Ethan's life looked perfect. But perfection is often deceiving. Despite his outward success, there was an emptiness inside him that no amount of money or accolades could fill. Late nights at the office gave way to solitary evenings in expensive restaurants where he dined alone, scrolling through his phone instead of engaging with the world around him. The penthouse apartment he bought, a symbol of all he had achieved, felt cold and impersonal, its sleek furniture untouched by the warmth of family or laughter. Sometimes, when he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he wondered if this was really what he wanted. Weekends were the hardest. While his coworkers spent time with their families or went on vacations, Ethan filled his days with meaningless activities, golfing with clients, attending networking events, or simply wandering aimlessly through the city. He tried dating a few times, hoping to find someone who could replace the void Claire had left behind. But none of those relationships lasted long. Each woman he met seemed shallow compared to Claire, unable to match her kindness, patience, or strength. Deep down, Ethan knew he hadn't truly moved on. He'd just convinced himself he didn't need anyone. Occasionally, thoughts of Claire crept into his mind uninvited. What was she doing now? Had she found someone else? Was she happy? These questions haunted him, especially during quiet moments when there was nothing to distract him. Once, he almost called her, but stopped himself at the last second. What would he even say? "Hi, remember me? The guy who abandoned you." The shame of what he'd done kept him silent. Over time, Ethan became adept at burying those feelings. He told himself he was better off alone, free from the complications of marriage and responsibility. He surrounded himself with people who admired his accomplishments, but never asked too many questions about his personal life. To the outside world, Ethan Carter was a self-made man living the dream. Only he knew the truth, that beneath the polished exterior lay a man who had sacrificed something far more valuable than wealth or status: connection. Years passed, and Ethan continued climbing the ladder, earning promotions and accolades that should have brought him immense satisfaction. Yet each victory felt hollow, like applause echoing in an empty room. He began to notice how lonely his life had become. Friends invited him to parties, but he rarely accepted. Colleagues celebrated milestones with their spouses and children, while Ethan sat quietly in the corner, nursing a drink and pretending not to care. One evening, as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse overlooking the glittering city lights, Ethan allowed himself to imagine what might have been. If he hadn't left Claire, would they still be together? Would they have built a home filled with love and laughter? Or would they have drifted apart anyway? These what-ifs tormented him, gnawing at the edges of his carefully constructed reality. For the first time in years, Ethan let himself admit the truth. He missed Claire. Not the idea of her, but the real person, the one who had stood by him when no one else believed in him, the one whose smile used to light up even his darkest days. As he turned away from the balcony and stepped back inside, Ethan resolved to push those thoughts aside once again. After all, there was nothing he could do to change the past, or so he believed. Little did he know, fate had other plans, plans that would force him to confront the choices he had made and the family he had left behind. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Ethan found himself attending a charity gala hosted by his company. The event was held in a grand ballroom adorned with chandeliers and elegant flower arrangements. Guests mingled under soft lighting, sipping champagne and discussing the latest trends in philanthropy. For Ethan, these events had become routine, a chance to network, make connections, and maintain his image as a successful executive. But this time, something caught his attention that would change everything. In one corner of the room, a photo exhibit showcased stories of families overcoming adversity. The display featured portraits accompanied by captions describing their journeys, stories of resilience, hope, and triumph against all odds. Ethan wasn't particularly interested in such things. He usually avoided these emotional displays, preferring to stick to business talk. However, something compelled him to take a closer look. Perhaps it was boredom, or maybe curiosity. Either way, he wandered over. As he scanned the photographs, one picture stopped him cold. It showed 4 identical toddlers sitting together on a couch, their faces beaming with laughter. They were quadruplets, each dressed in matching outfits, their expressions so full of joy that they seemed to leap off the frame. Beneath the photo was a caption: "The Miracle Quadruplets." a story of love and perseverance. Ethan read the accompanying text, which described how the mother had faced countless challenges raising her children alone, but never lost sight of hope or love. But it wasn't just the children who caught his eye. It was the woman standing beside them. She was smiling warmly, her arms wrapped protectively around the little ones. Her face was familiar, though older and more weathered than he remembered. Still, there was no mistaking her. It was Claire. His Claire. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the photograph, unable to tear his eyes away. Memories flooded back. Memories of late-night conversations, shared dreams, and promises made under the stars. How could this be? Had Claire remarried? Was she living happily with someone else? And what about the children? Were they hers? If so, how had she managed to raise quadruplets on her own? A wave of emotions hit him all at once. Shock, guilt, regret, and even a flicker of pride. Pride because Claire had clearly done an incredible job raising these children despite overwhelming odds. Guilt because he hadn't been there to support her. Regret because he had walked away without looking back. Ethan felt like the ground beneath him had shifted, leaving him unsteady and unsure of what to do next. He glanced around the room, half expecting Claire to walk in at any moment. Would she recognize him if she saw him? Would she want anything to do with him after all these years? The thought of facing her filled him with dread, yet he couldn't shake the urge to know more. Who were these children? What kind of life had Claire built for herself? Questions swirled in his mind, demanding answers. For the rest of the evening, Ethan barely paid attention to the gala. He excused himself from conversations, declining offers to network or discuss upcoming projects. Instead, he stood near the exhibit, staring at the photograph as if it held the key to understanding his past, and perhaps his future. By the time the event ended, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave without finding out more about Claire and the quadruplets. Something deep inside him, a mix of curiosity, guilt, and longing, compelled him to seek the truth. As he left the ballroom that night, Ethan felt a strange sense of purpose. For years, he had convinced himself that walking away from Claire was the right decision, that he was better off alone. But now, standing face to face with evidence of the life she had created without him, he realized how wrong he had been. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The photograph of Claire and the quadruplets haunted Ethan long after the gala ended. It wasn't just the image itself, but the questions it raised. Questions he couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried. Who were those children? Were they hers? And if they were, how had she managed to raise them alone? The thought of Claire facing such a monumental challenge without him stirred something deep inside, a mix of guilt, admiration, and an overwhelming need to know more. Ethan decided to dig deeper, though he approached the task cautiously. He didn't want to barge into Claire's life recklessly. Instead, he started by reaching out to mutual acquaintances from their past. At first, people were hesitant to talk. Some hadn't seen Claire in years, while others seemed reluctant to share details about her life. But eventually, Ethan found someone who knew her, a former coworker named Lisa who still kept in touch with Claire through social media. Over coffee, Lisa confirmed what Ethan had feared. The quadruplets were indeed Claire's children. She explained that Claire had discovered she was pregnant with them, just months after Ethan left. The news came as a shock, not only because carrying quadruplets is rare, but also because it meant Claire would face countless challenges ahead. Money was tight, and raising one child alone would have been difficult enough, let alone four. Yet Claire never complained. Instead, she poured all her energy into creating a loving home for her babies. She worked so hard, Lisa said, shaking her head in amazement. She took odd jobs during the day and cared for the kids at night. People offered to help, but she always insisted she could handle it herself. She didn't want anyone's pity or yours. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Hearing how fiercely independent Claire had been only made him feel worse about abandoning her. He imagined her struggling to juggle work, sleepless nights, and the endless demands of caring for newborns, all without a partner to lean on. How had she done it? Where had she found the strength? Lisa went on to describe how Claire's determination inspired everyone around her. Friends organized fundraisers to help with medical bills when the quadruplets were born prematurely. Neighbors pitched in with meals and babysitting. Despite the hardships, Claire remained optimistic, focusing on giving her children the best life possible. "She's amazing," Lisa concluded. "Honestly, I don't think I could have handled even half of what she did." As Ethan listened, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. Pride swelled within him for Claire's resilience and courage, but it was overshadowed by shame for not being there when she needed him most. He realized now that leaving hadn't solved anything. It had only made things harder for her. The weight of his absence pressed down on him, heavier than ever before. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan scrolled through old photos on his phone, searching for pictures of Claire from their early days together. Each image brought back memories, happy ones this time, not tinged with regret. He remembered how excited she used to get planning their future, talking about having kids someday. Back then, Ethan had brushed off those conversations, telling himself there would be plenty of time for family later. Now, looking at the reality of Claire's life, the miracle quadruplets he'd seen in that photograph, he understood how wrong he had been. By morning, Ethan knew what he had to do. Ignoring the voice in his head warning him to leave well enough alone, he began searching for ways to contact Claire directly. He told himself it wasn't about guilt or redemption. It was about understanding. He needed to see her, to meet the children who had grown up without knowing him, and perhaps in some small way, make amends for the years he'd missed. What Ethan didn't realize was that reaching out to Claire wouldn't just answer his questions. It would force him to confront the person he had become and decide whether he was ready to change. Ethan spent days rehearsing what he would say to Claire. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. How could it be? After years of silence, showing up out of the blue would either anger her or leave her indifferent. But despite his fears, Ethan couldn't stay away. Armed with an address he'd managed to track down through old records, he drove to Claire's neighborhood one crisp Saturday morning. Her house was modest but charming, with flower boxes hanging from the windows and a small garden out front. It looked like the kind of home that radiated warmth and love, a stark contrast to the cold, empty penthouse Ethan called home. As he stood on her porch, his heart pounded so loudly he was sure she'd hear it before he even knocked. Taking a deep breath, he raised his hand and rapped gently on the door. For a moment, there was no response. Then the sound of footsteps approached, and the door creaked open. Claire stood there, looking as beautiful as ever, though her eyes widened in shock when she saw him. For a split second, neither of them spoke. "Ethan," she finally said, her voice laced with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" He swallowed hard, suddenly at a loss for words. All the apologies he practiced on the drive over seemed inadequate now. "Claire, I'm sorry," he stammered. "I know this is unexpected, but I needed to see you." Her expression hardened. "After all these years, you just show up. Do you have any idea how much pain you caused me?" Ethan nodded, lowering his gaze. "I do, and I can't take back what I did, but I wanted to explain, to try to make things right somehow." Claire crossed her arms, clearly torn between slamming the door in his face and hearing him out. After a long pause, she sighed and stepped aside. "Come in," she said curtly, "but don't expect forgiveness." Inside, the house was cozy and inviting, filled with toys scattered across the living room floor and colorful artwork pinned to the walls. Ethan felt a pang of guilt as he realized how much work had gone into building this life, a life he had no part in creating. Before Claire could say anything else, 4 pairs of curious eyes peeked around the corner. The quadruplets appeared, their identical faces lighting up with excitement. They were older than in the photograph, perhaps 6 or 7 years old now, but their resemblance to each other was uncanny. One of them, a girl wearing a bright pink dress, stepped forward boldly. "Who's that, Mommy?" she asked, pointing at Ethan. Claire hesitated, glancing at him briefly before answering. "This is someone from my past. His name is Ethan." The children stared at him, unblinking, their curiosity evident. Another child, a boy clutching a toy car, tilted his head. "Are you our daddy?" The question hit Ethan like a freight train. He hadn't expected it, not yet. At least, and he froze, unsure how to respond. Claire quickly intervened, kneeling down to their level. "No, sweetie," she said softly. "He's just an old friend." Ethan winced at the word friend. Was that really all he was now? Someone from another lifetime, erased from the narrative of Claire's family. Claire ushered the children into the next room, promising them cookies if they stayed occupied. Once they were gone, she turned back to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "Why are you here, Ethan? Really?" He took a shaky breath, choosing his words carefully. "I saw your picture, with the kids, at that charity gala. I didn't know about them until then. I didn't know you were raising quadruplets alone. I came because I wanted to understand, to apologize. You didn't deserve what I did to you." Claire studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. Finally, she let out a slow sigh. "You're right. I didn't deserve it, but I survived. I built a life for myself and my children without you. So whatever you're hoping for, Ethan, don't think you can just waltz back in and fix things." Her words stung, but Ethan knew she was right. He had no illusions about making amends overnight, or ever. But standing there, surrounded by evidence of Claire's strength and resilience, he realized something important. This wasn't about fixing things for himself. It was about honoring the family she had created and finding a way to contribute, however small. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said quietly. "Not yet. But if you'll let me, I want to help. In whatever way you'll allow." Claire hesitated again, clearly conflicted. She didn't trust him. That much was obvious. But there was also a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, she was willing to give him a chance. "Fine," she said after a long pause. "We'll see. But don't get too comfortable. This doesn't mean we're friends." Ethan nodded, grateful for even the smallest opening. As he left the house later that day, he felt a strange sense of hope. For the first time in years, he had a purpose beyond him. Ethan didn't waste any time after his first meeting with Claire. He knew he had to prove himself, not just with words but with actions. Over the next few weeks, he reached out repeatedly, always respectful of Claire's boundaries. At first, she kept him at arm's length, replying to his messages with short, cautious responses. But Ethan was persistent, and slowly she began to soften. His first attempt to reconnect involved offering financial support. It felt like the most practical step. He could never undo the hardships Claire endured, but he could ease her burden now. When he broached the topic during one of their brief conversations, however, Claire immediately shut him down. "I don't need your money," she said firmly. "We've done fine without it so far." Ethan respected her decision, though it frustrated him. He wanted to help in some tangible way, yet every suggestion he made seemed to hit a wall. Then, one afternoon, Claire surprised him by agreeing to let him take the quadruplets to the park for a few hours. She emphasized that it wasn't because she trusted him completely, it was simply because she needed a break. For Ethan, this small concession felt like a victory. The day at the park was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. The children were curious about him, peppering him with questions he wasn't prepared for. "Why did you leave, Mommy?" one of them asked innocently as they played on the swings. Ethan froze, unsure how to answer. Thankfully, another child distracted them by pointing out a squirrel climbing a tree, saving him from an awkward explanation. Despite the occasional uncomfortable moment, Ethan found himself enjoying their company. They laughed easily, their energy infectious. He pushed them on the swings, helped them build sandcastles, and even joined in a game of tag. By the end of the afternoon, His shirt was covered in dirt, and his legs ached, but he hadn't felt this alive in years. When he returned the kids to Claire, she raised an eyebrow at his disheveled appearance, but didn't comment. Instead, she thanked him curtly and ushered the children inside. Ethan left feeling hopeful, knowing he'd taken a tiny step toward earning her trust. Over the following months, these outings became more frequent. Sometimes it was a trip to the zoo. Other times, it was helping with homework or attending school events. Each interaction gave Ethan a chance to learn more about the children and about himself. He marveled at their individual personalities. Emma, the bold leader; Liam, the quiet thinker; Ava, the artist; and Noah, the jokester. Watching them interact with Claire, he saw firsthand the love and patience she poured into raising them. Claire remained guarded, but Ethan noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She stopped referring to him as someone from my past and instead introduced him to others as a family friend. It wasn't much, but it meant something. Occasionally, she'd share snippets of their lives. The sleepless nights when the babies were sick, the joy of watching them take their first steps together, the pride she felt when they started school. These stories painted a picture of resilience that left Ethan in awe. One evening, after dropping the kids off at home, Claire invited him to stay for coffee. It was the first time she'd extended such an invitation, and Ethan accepted eagerly. Sitting across from her in her cozy kitchen, he listened as she talked about her dreams for the future. Dreams centered around her children's happiness and success. There was no bitterness in her voice, only determination. "You're doing an incredible job," Ethan said sincerely. "I can't imagine how hard it must have been." Claire looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but I had no choice. They needed me." Her words struck a chord within him. For the first time, Ethan realized that redemption wasn't about fixing the past. It was about embracing the present and contributing to the future. As he left her house that night, he made a silent promise to himself. He would continue showing up, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because Claire and her children deserved someone who cared. Little by little, Ethan began to feel like part of their world. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time in years, Ethan understood what it meant to truly belong. As months turned into years, Ethan's role in the Quadruplets' lives grew steadily. What began as hesitant visits to the park evolved into a consistent presence at soccer games, school plays, and family dinners. Claire still kept him at a distance emotionally, but her resistance softened with time. She allowed him to help not because she needed him, but because she saw how much the children enjoyed having him around. The Quadruplets, now 8 years old, had come to adore Ethan. At first, they called him Mr. Ethan, their polite formality betraying their uncertainty about this stranger in their lives. But as he spent more time with them, the formalities faded. They started calling him Uncle Ethan, a title that made his heart swell with pride. He wasn't their father, and he never pretended to be, but he cherished the bond they were building. Each child had a unique personality, and Ethan loved discovering what made them tick. Emma, the fearless leader, often challenged him during board games, refusing to let him win even when he joked about letting her take the victory. Liam, the quiet thinker, surprised him one day by presenting a detailed model of the solar system he built for school, a project inspired, apparently, by their trip to the planetarium. Ava filled sketchbooks with colorful drawings, gifting Ethan a picture of the two of them flying kites in the park. And Noah, the jokester, kept everyone laughing with his endless supply of puns and silly faces. Ethan marveled at how different yet connected they were. Watching them interact with Claire, he saw glimpses of her strength reflected in each of them, their resilience, kindness, and boundless curiosity. It was clear they adored her, and Ethan couldn't help but admire the way she balanced discipline with unconditional love. Being around them reminded him of everything he had missed out on, and everything he could still gain if he stayed committed. Claire, too, noticed changes, not just in the children but in herself. While she hadn't forgiven Ethan entirely, she found comfort in his reliability. When the kids needed new shoes or struggled with math homework, Ethan stepped in without being asked. He didn't expect gratitude, nor did he push for deeper involvement. His quiet consistency spoke louder than words ever could. Over time, Claire began to see him less as the man who abandoned her and more as someone genuinely trying to make amends. One evening, after tucking the kids into bed, Claire joined Ethan on the porch. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. For a while, neither of them spoke, content to watch the stars twinkling above. "You've changed," Claire said finally, breaking the silence. Her tone wasn't accusatory, it was matter-of-fact, tinged with curiosity. Ethan nodded, turning to look at her. "I think I have. Or maybe I'm finally becoming the person I should have been all along." Claire studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed softly. "It hasn't been easy, you know. Letting you back in, trusting you again. There are days when I wonder if I'm making a mistake." "I won't hurt you again," Ethan replied earnestly. "I can't promise I'll always get things right, but I'll keep showing up. For them. And for you." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Claire didn't respond immediately, but the ghost of a smile crossed her lips. Whether it was acceptance or acknowledgement, Ethan couldn't tell, but it gave him hope. By the time the Quadruplets turned 9, they had stopped calling him Uncle Ethan altogether. One afternoon, as they played catch in the backyard, Noel blurted out, "Can we call you Dad?" The question caught Ethan off guard, and he glanced nervously at Claire, who stood nearby watching. She gave him a small nod, her eyes warm with encouragement. "Only if you want to," Ethan told the children, his voice thick with emotion. To his surprise, they cheered, hugging him tightly. In that moment, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years: belonging. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. Healing wounds took time, and forgiveness wasn't something that came easily. But as he looked at Claire and the children, he realized something important. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about creating a future worth fighting for, one filled with laughter, love, and second chances. Years passed, and life for Ethan, Claire, and the Quadruplets settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. The children were now teenagers, bright, confident, and full of dreams. They had grown up calling Ethan Dad, though they understood he wasn't their biological father. To them, it didn't matter. What mattered was the love and support he gave them every day. Over time, Ethan proved himself not just through grand gestures, but through small, consistent acts of kindness. He attended parent-teacher conferences, cheered at basketball games, and stayed up late helping with science projects. Slowly, he became an irreplaceable part of their lives. Claire, too, had changed. While she still carried scars from the past, her relationship with Ethan evolved into something neither of them had anticipated: a partnership built on mutual respect and shared responsibility. They weren't romantically involved, nor did they plan to be. Instead, they worked together as co-parents, navigating challenges side by side. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced, reminders of the pain Ethan had caused, but they faced them head-on, talking openly and honestly. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made all the difference. The turning point came one spring afternoon during the Quadruplets' high school graduation ceremony. Dressed in caps and gowns, the 4 siblings stood proudly on stage as names were called and diplomas handed out. Emma delivered the valedictorian speech, her words inspiring applause from the crowd. Liam received an award for academic excellence, while Ava's artwork was featured in the program cover. Even Noah earned recognition for his leadership in the drama club. As each child walked across the stage, Ethan and Claire sat beside each other, tears streaming down their faces. Afterward, the family gathered for photos beneath a canopy of trees. The Quadruplets posed together, laughing and teasing one another as cameras clicked. Ethan wrapped an arm around Claire, pulling her close as they watched their children celebrate. For the first time in years, there was no tension between them, only gratitude for how far they'd come. That evening, as the party wound down, Ethan pulled Claire aside. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. She nodded, and they stepped onto the porch, where fireflies danced in the twilight. "I've been thinking about something," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I know I'll never fully make up for leaving you, but I want you to know I'm proud of us, of what we've built together." Claire smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted. "But these kids, they're proof that even broken things can be mended. You've done so much for them, Ethan, more than I ever thought possible." Her words filled him with warmth, but also humility. "They've saved me, Claire," he confessed. "Before them, I was lost. They taught me what it means to truly belong, to have a purpose bigger than myself." For a moment, they simply stood there, letting the quiet stretch between them. Then Claire turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for coming back, for staying." Ethan reached out, gently squeezing her hand. "Thank you," he replied, "for giving me a second chance." As the night deepened, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from the selfish man who abandoned his wife to the father who now stood shoulder to shoulder with her, celebrating their children's achievements. He knew he'd never erase the mistakes of his past, but he'd learned that redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, forgiveness, and the willingness to keep showing up, even when it was hard. Inside, the quadruplets laughed and chattered, already dreaming about college and the future. Watching them, Ethan realized something profound. Family wasn't defined by blood or biology. It was forged through love, sacrifice, and the shared moments that bind people together. And in this unlikely, imperfect family, he had found exactly where he belonged.